morning, everyone. My name is Todd Kimball. I will be your MC today. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It is National Tooth Fairy Day today. We don't celebrate the supernatural, but I think we can honor the Tooth Fairy. So a reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by arts, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Our speaker, John Seager, entertained us in the green room pre-meeting time with some quotes from Dorothy Parker. I'll turn it over to you this morning, John, for a couple of quotes serving as our reading.
Well, thank you. And I mentioned Dorothy Parker, the great wit and member of the Algonquin Roundtable, because today is her birthday. She's not with us here to celebrate it. At one point, she was asked what she wanted on her tombstone, and she replied, "I told you I wasn't feeling well," which is a pretty good line. A couple of other selections from Dorothy. "Don't look at me in that tone of voice." is pretty good, I think. I'm actually doing a little editing because some of her quotes again are I don't know you all that well, but some are a little out there. But here's one. Another one about her tombstone, of all things. "That would be a good thing for them to cut on my tombstone. Wherever she went, including here, it was against her better judgment." which I think is good. And this one, which I think unfortunately applies to so much of what's going on in the news these days. This wasn't just plain terrible. This was fancy terrible. This was terrible with raisins in it. And I think she's another one. "And if my heart be scarred and burned, the safer I for all I learned." About some unnamed man. She was pleased to have him come and never sorry to see him go. So she was had a quite modern cast of mind. And here's another one. "The best way to keep children at home is to make the home atmosphere pleasant and let the air out of the tires." It is. And one about a bit of misbehavior. "A hangover is the wrath of grapes." So she had a way about her, and I think that, and I'll leave you just this last one in the interest of time. "I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." And I think even in the worst of times, we have to find some humor and some sense of the world and try to figure out how to kind of get through it. I'm scrolling looking for one really particularly good one, but I just think without getting too deep into it, I remember a cartoon I saw once in the New Yorker, and it was this couple who lived in this one room with the cracked walls and the light bulb hanging down from the ceiling. And the man had just come in the door, and his wife is sitting kind of disconsolate at the table like this. And he says to her, "I heard some good news today, dear. We passed this way but once." So I think we have to find humor, and the best kind of humor is the humor when we laugh at ourselves and our own shortcomings. And in my case, that's easy to do. And be careful in that humor that we always punch up, not down. My grandfather was an Episcopal minister turned editorial writer a century ago. And he delivered a sermon more than 100 years ago that made its way onto the part of which made it way onto the front page of the Boston Globe and earned the enmity of his higher ups in the church, because he said, "We're always hearing about the plight of the poor. Let's think for a minute about the plight of the rich. They worry so much about their money. If we took their money away from them, they wouldn't have to worry about it so much." And I learned along the way that this got him in a spot of trouble with the hierarchy in the church. And although he never officially left the church, he shifted gears and became a crusading progressive editorial writer who championed the rights of women and other things. I'm not quite sure how I got there, but I do tend to digress. In fact, on my tombstone, that's what I want, which is, but I digress. So I will end this digression and let you get on with your program.
Well, thank you, John, for serving as both our reader and our presenter this morning. John Seager is the Executive Director of Population Connection, formerly Zero Population Growth. Population Connection is the national grassroots population organization that educates young people and advocates progressive action to stabilize world population at a level that can be sustained by Earth's resources. Before joining Population Connection, John worked at the EPA during the Clinton administration. He is a veteran of more than 50 political campaigns, including serving as chief of staff for Peter Kosmayer, a former US Congressman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Seager earned a BA in political science from Trinity College in Connecticut. Let's have a warm yet muted HGP welcome for John Seager.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not entirely sure I earned that BA, but they did give me one. After college, I did what I got my degree in political science. What all good political scientists do, I became a carpenter and spent the next few years of my life building things until I came to the rather sad realization that I was a mediocre carpenter. And so I moved over into politics where mediocrity is championed and considered a value. So I had to find something where I could work where my skill set, my mediocre skill set, would be adequately rewarded. We did indeed change our name, the organization. We were founded back in 1968. Some of you may know that there was a book that came out that year called The Population Bomb that many people think was written by Paul Ehrlich, but it wasn't. As Dr. Ehrlich will tell you, it was co-authored by Paul and his wife, Anne. But the publisher said, oh, we don't need her name on it. And to his everlasting chagrin, he didn't put up a fight. And they've co-authored many books since then, and her name is, of course, always prominently on it. But the circumstances around the book, which gave rise to our birth as an organization, are relevant. And you know, imagine, if you will, if you were say a young person back then, and some of you were, and you'd gone to work for a publishing firm, and you got the bottom of the pile job of going through unsolicited manuscripts. And imagine, hypothetically, if a slim volume had showed up in your pile, and it was a short book about human population written by a bug expert. And I don't know if you ran to your editor and said, I think I've come across a bestseller, that he would agree with you. In fact, The Population Bomb sold some 3 million copies and was indeed a bestseller. I suspect that if the book had been written 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it might not have had it anywhere near the traction it had. It came at an opportune moment, and it was an opportune moment because that is when we in the United States were going through I think could be called a fertility revolution. In 1960, the average woman in the United States had about 3.7, 3.8 children. By 1977, less than 20 years later, that had dropped by more than 50%. So you saw this dramatic change. It was actually more like 3.4 to 1.7, but it was a dramatic change in family size in less than 20 years. And it happened without any coercion. It was not the result of some crisis or calamity. It happened because of the confluence of certain events and circumstances, one of which was technology. And the specific technology was modern birth control, which I would submit to you needs to make the list of the top 5 or 6 most transformative technologies in human history, right up there with the wheel, the printing press, Netflix, and other things that have changed our lives. And it was transformative, I think, the obvious reason, or should be obvious, that for the first time in human history, half of the people on the planet had, at least in theory, the ability to control the trajectory of their reproductive lives. And if that's not a transformative technology, I don't know what is. So there was this change in technology. There was also two other major shifts that occurred. One was that is when women began to go to college in great numbers in the United States. For men, it started a bit earlier with the GI Bill after World War II, but in the 60s and 70s is when women began to go to college in great numbers. And of course, when a woman gets a college education, every career becomes a woman's career, as it should be. And so many, many women began to decide to postpone having children or have fewer children. And that was a dramatic shift. And the third shift had to do with law. That was when the Supreme Court ruled, and it's astonishing that this didn't happen until that era, that married couples and then later anyone had the right to buy contraception. There were laws on the books where even a married couple, in theory, could be put in jail, the Comstock Acts, for buying birth control. And the Supreme Court ruled that there was this right to privacy that was embedded really not so much in our Constitution, but in our tradition of common law, which predates the Constitution. And part of that reasoning resulted in the court issuing a limited right to abortion. Personally, I don't think it should be limited. I think it should be up to women, period, full stop. But in Roe v. Wade, the court did at least recognize some right to privacy among women. And of course, that right is under assault at the moment. And if you take these three things and sort of throw them together, they make a fourth, which was really a cultural shift. And all of those things kind of came at a moment when the book was published, and the book really resonated with people. Now, in that book, the Ehrlichs predicted a massive global famine. That did not happen because at the same time the book was being published, something else was happening. Of course, at any given moment, many things are happening. And the other thing that was happening was the Green Revolution, led by Dr. Norman Borlaug, and who incidentally, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution, in accepting it, he warned that if we don't deal with population growth, none of this is going to make any difference. Now, the Green Revolution, which again saved an enormous number of people, is built on a foundation of petrochemicals, not just petrochemicals, also seed development and other things, but pesticides, fungicides, fertilizers, and just the fuel that powers all the agricultural vehicles, or almost all of them. It all comes from oil. And what we did, in effect, was we went to the Earth Bank and we borrowed 50 years. And now the Earth Bank is telling us, well, guess what? The note is due. And we're sort of going, what do you mean? What note? What do you mean due? You mean we have to pay this back? It occurred to me recently that so many of the travails in this world come from one of two things. Either we ignore the rights of women or we ignore the laws of nature. And when it comes to population growth, those two things join together to put us in both in the situation we're now in and also create the opportunity for transformative change. And I'd like to, if I could, to shift to some slides now that I want to inflict on an innocent audience. And I hope you find them interesting. Let's see if I can do that. So do you see a slide now, folks? This first slide, several weeks ago, my wife and I were in Vermont. And this is a picture of Mount Mansfield in Vermont, taken at around that time. But look carefully at the back of the picture toward the top. That's actually Mount Mansfield, not that small hill below. I've been to Vermont many times. When you get there, you are stunned by the Green Mountains. They are the Green Mountains, and they are Green Mountains, to be sure. Not this trip. This is what they looked like because of the Western wildfires. A continent away were transforming the Green Mountains. You could smell the smoke. You could smell the smoke from the fires out your way. The earth is literally on fire at this point. And I'm not sure what, if anything, is going to wake us up, but you would think that that this would. This is what is going on, and I don't have to tell anybody out your way about that, but it's affecting places far and wide. Now, we know what is causing this. We know that the leading driver is climate change. And what is driving climate change? He said, wondering why his slide wouldn't advance, but it will momentarily. There it is. Whoop, went too far. There we go, getting back there. If you look at climate change, this rather dull looking pie chart on the right breaks down the global carbon impacts. And you look around the list there, electricity and heat production, agriculture and forestry, buildings, transportation, industry, other. Well, I'm not suggesting that's inaccurate, but it's misleading. It's both accurate and misleading because the one thing you don't see on this slide is people. Before we were in Vermont, we spent a little time in Maine. This is a picture of our vacation spot. Not really. It's just a stock picture I came across of a beach somewhere, possibly in Asia, but just a photo. And if you look carefully, you'll see down to the lower left, there is actually a little room left to come on in and enjoy the peace and solitude of the ocean there. This is us. This is the driver of climate change, certainly not necessarily the people in this picture more than many others, but all of us in various ways, some of us much more than others, are the drivers of climate change. And when you look at going back 250 years or so, when you look at CO2 emissions and you look at world population, the charts are basically the same. There's no difference between them. They just run right alongside one another there. As world population growth has grown, so has CO2. Now, having said that, it is important to note that like so many things in the world, there is vastly unequal distribution of this. There are people who today have what I think can only be called, and I number myself among them, carbon obesity. There are other people in parts of the world who are suffering from what can be called carbon starvation. But when you put us all together and you lump us all together on this little blue marble we share, these lines are identical lines. And when you look at human population growth, you notice that this is a modern phenomenon. It took all of human history to get to 1 billion people around 1800. Before that, over the previous 20 centuries or so, we added about 400,000 people a year to the planet, 400,000 people a year for about 20 centuries on average. Today, we add 80 million people a year. So human population is growing not twice as fast, not 20 times as fast, but 200 times as fast. It's like the difference between taking a brisk stroll in Portland and flying over it in a supersonic jet. So human population growth is the driver of many things. And the reason it got started back around 1800 was because of one of the most positive developments in human history. Children, thanks to modern sanitation and the rudiments of modern medicine, began surviving their childhood. Up until then, many children did not, and that is still true in some parts of the world. But children began to survive their childhood. It wasn't that people were living longer so much until Ronald Reagan, our longest lived president, was our second president, John Adams. But beginning in the early 1800s, we started seeing child survival numbers go way up. And it wasn't women having more children, it was more children surviving, which is a wonderful thing in and of itself, but it's a challenge that has some consequences to it. Similarly, if you were to win one of those big lotteries, I guarantee you would rapidly discover you have more cousins than you thought you ever had. So even good events can have consequences. And so we now add about 80 million people a year. We add some billion people to the planet every dozen years or so. And for those who think population growth is a thing of the past, they need to take a look at the numbers, because that's simply not the case. It is definitely going on at a breakneck speed around the world. Here's one depiction of it, of sort of where we are in this fishbowl that we live in, that we think will continue to sustain us. And there's a one-line poem, if I'm quoting it correctly, from the Beat era poet, although he didn't much care for the Beats, Kenneth Patchen, which goes something like this. So it always is with the small birds who believe the sky will be smart enough to appreciate their invention of flying. We just simply, on some level, just think things will keep going on as they have. Perhaps this fish is starting to worry a little bit there. So here's a quote on the subject that I find particularly trenchant. The modern plague of overpopulation is soluble by the means we've discovered and with resources we possess. Overpopulation, plague, strong language. What is lacking is not sufficient knowledge of the solution, but a universal consciousness of the gravity of the problem, and education of the billions who are its victims. Who said those words? Who referred to overpopulation as a plague, which is strong language? Well, this is who it was. Those are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. He wrote those words in 1966 at a time when human population was less than half what it is today. And he didn't mince his words when he put them forward. What's also, I think, important here is the second half of that quote, which is, it's not enough to just know things. You have to somehow have consciousness. I remember in my college, dimly remember my college years, where I had knowledge of when term papers were due long before I had consciousness of the gravity of the problem, which usually arrived around 11 p.m. the night before they were due at the professor's desk. So to be serious on the subject for a moment, I am old enough to remember being a passenger in the car with my parents back east as they drove to the south and seeing the colored only signs on the bathrooms. People knew, most people, I would submit to you, knew there was something terribly wrong here. But it took Dr. King and Rosa Parks and so many others whose names we know and so many others whose names we don't know, who managed through their struggle and through their sacrifice, and their ultimate sacrifice in some cases, to transfer us from knowledge to consciousness. And if there's a harder thing to do in this world, I don't know what it is. Getting in I'm sure it takes a lot of technology to get into a metal tube and go up in space. And I admire the skill sets it takes to do that. But I think those pale beside what it takes to move the human race from knowledge to consciousness. There is a reason why we celebrate Dr. King's Day as a holiday, because he did that in a way that no other American has ever done to the same extent. Now, that was then, this is now. And it's important to note that we need to listen to voices from the global South. And I've done a lot of reading and a lot of examination of that. And when you look at what voices are saying in the places where the most rapid population growth is occurring, which include many parts of Africa and parts of Asia and some parts of Central America, those voices, including this woman who is the executive director of the National Population Council in Ghana, here's what she calls it. She calls it overpopulation. One of the things we're doing as an organization is we're now adding people to our national board who are those voices from the global South, people from Central America, people who are now in Central America and Africa who work on these issues. Because I think it's not enough for us just to quote them. We have to put them in positions of leadership and listen to them and pay attention when they tell us, when they try to raise the alarm about these issues. And they do, and we need to listen to them and their voices. We hear a lot about climate change. I don't think the phrase is all that useful. Change is inevitable, but what's going on is really climate chaos. I don't think there's another, we need perhaps to call it something different. And I don't know what that is, but climate chaos comes close. It's extraordinary, the devastation that is occurring. Here's a cartoon I like, one of many on the subject. You can see it. It's now for religious and political reasons. Let's pretend none of these are related to overpopulation. And you see a lot of that going on. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I want to note that that there are some people of faith who step forward, and certainly Dr. King was one of them, and there are others today. And there are certainly some politicians who step forward. One of the first things Joe Biden did when he became president was to rescind the odious global gag rule. And he has also indicated strong support for the programs that we advocate across the board. So there are many politicians who are doing the right thing, but there is still some degree of, shall we say, unwillingness to use the P word, population. And if I had to choose when it comes to politicians between those who are willing to use the word and those who are willing to vote for the programs, I'll take the programs over the rhetoric any day of the week. As long as they vote for the right stuff, I don't really care that much what they talk about, given a choice between the two. But one way or another, we need to start doing a lot more to address this. When for some reason, occasionally my slides decide, there we go. So who is it that is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions? Whose responsibility is it? Well, I think I was recently behind this fellow on the road. I don't know if you've ever been out on the road when he's driving. It really isn't the bears, not even the stuffed bear, who are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. It's us. It's all of us. And certainly some of us, particularly those of us who have been visited by fortune and have some degree of affluence, we are the biggest culprits in the world when it comes to this. But let's keep in mind, there are billions of people who understandably want what we have. The continent, the place where use of air conditioning is growing the most rapidly in the world is Africa, from a very, very low level right now. People there want, by and large, a lot of what we have, and who can blame them? And so we're left with a situation where we either address the phenomenon of population growth, we keep our fingers crossed and hope they stay poor, which seems like a bad plan, or we kind of just invest blind faith, not in just one technology, but in a vast array of technologies that somehow their combined impact will occur rapidly enough to somehow stop this terrible phenomenon that is going on right now. That seems like a pretty long bet to make on a planet when we have no planet B. So when you look at the situation here in the United States for a moment, and there have been a lot of stories recently about a slowdown in our births, and that is true. There was a 4% reduction in the birth rate last year. To see the way some of the media covered it, you would think it was a 40% reduction. It was a slight diminution in the birth rate. We are still adding more than 1 million people last year, even with COVID and all of that, to the United States. And it's worth looking at where those births come from. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 37%, the most recent report the CDC has, of all births in the United States are unintended. Now, when you look at the total births, that is 1.3 million births in the United States that are unintended. Simply put, unintended births account for 100% of US population growth. Now, you can look at the pie otherwise. You can look at net migration. When you take all the numbers, adding and subtracting, people coming, people going, all of it. These are numbers for 2019. We don't have 2020 numbers yet. It was about 600,000. So it's about half in round numbers, the impact of unintended births in the US. So one of the things that I think most Americans agree on, not everyone, but most Americans agree that couples, women and couples should have the power to decide if they're going to have children. Now, you start bringing pregnancy into it, and it gets more complicated, but just a basic idea of whether people should be able to decide how many children to have. Most Americans agree on that. And it just seems like with all the fights that are going on, this is something we could somehow rally around and focus on those unintended births. Incidentally, Joe Biden did something recently, along with the majority in Congress, that's going to have, if it continues, a remarkable positive impact on many things. And that is the major increase in tax credits for children. When children grow up in poverty, they grow up under extreme stress. It affects their health, it affects their education, and none of us make great decisions when we're under stress. And so elevating the 10 million plus children who are living in poverty out of poverty will do a great deal, not only to improve their individual lives, not only to improve the broad life of our nation, but also to enable them to make better decisions about reproduction. I suspect that there are some people out there who, when they get these tax credits, may decide to have more children. But you've got to look at these policies holistically. You've got to look at them broadly. You can't look at them narrowly. And the positive impacts of this, including on population growth, far outweigh the negative ones. So looking at that, clearly we have unfinished business here at home. When you and what that unfinished business is here at home is something that, thankfully for many Americans, is a commonplace. This stock cheesy photo that I picked of the very nice woman being shown whatever she's being shown, but I'm using it as a placeholder for modern birth control. It should be boring. It should just be, oh, I'm going to stop at the CVS. It should be that easy. Well, for a lot of Americans, it isn't that easy. There are all kinds of barriers that are being placed constantly in the way of women's ability to control their own fertility at every level. And those barriers are being pursued by some of our fellow citizens who seem to prefer an earlier age, I guess we could say. They're nostalgic for another era that in some ways didn't exist, but when it came to restricting the rights of women, certainly did. But it should be commonplace. It should be kind of a no-brainer. Unfortunately, it isn't. And when you look at the way we can address this issue and the tools available to women, the numbers are kind of interesting. If you have 10,000 American women who are, heterosexual, sexually active in their childbearing years, if they don't use any method of contraception, about 8,500 will get pregnant. And when you scroll down the list here, you find out that if they use birth control pills, 900 will get pregnant. An improvement. If they were to elect to use implants, 5 out of 10,000. It is the closest thing to perfect that you will probably find in terms of methods. And it's not the right method for every woman, and that's a very private and personal decision. But it is fascinating that implants are 10 times more effective than tubal ligations and 3 times more effective than vasectomies. And they're completely reversible. Now, I've shown this information on many campuses, and I always point out to the students that I'm not a doctor and that they should get their medical advice from their roommate, like everybody does in college. But it certainly is information that might be useful to some. I want to add quickly that there has been a shameful lack of progress when it comes to male contraception. Men are, at the least, equally responsible here, although I'm not sure the word men and responsible should be put in the same sentence or even the same paragraph. And there has been some recent progress on male contraception, and I just want to show you a method here that is now available that is in some public washrooms, where for just 25 cents, the man can, and if you look carefully at the level at which that punching glove comes out, you'll see how it works. It's a form of male birth control that is fast, cheap, and effective, but it does have some side effects, including soreness upon standing. I don't mean to make light of the situation, but if Dorothy Parker can, so shall I. I just want to point out that if men could get pregnant, as a young woman once said, at a meeting I was attending, birth control pills would be free and bacon flavored. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to their credit, is funding research into male contraception. It's not a big profit center for pharmaceutical companies. And so what Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has said, we'll front load the cost of the research. We don't need the money back, just develop the methods and then they can get them out there. Hopefully we'll begin to see more progress. There's an old joke about male contraception, which is that it's 10 years away from practical application and always will be. But hopefully we will begin to see more methods so that men can have more ways in which they can step up and be responsible partners in the process here. Now, globally, when you look at human population, what you see is growth, and this is the UN's latest numbers here. We're pushing toward 8 billion at the moment, and every couple of years, the UN runs the numbers for every country on Earth, and they don't make any predictions, they only do projections. And right now they're projecting, their medium projection has it that we will add about 3 billion more people to the planet by 2100. Essentially, all of that population growth, when you take into account the additions and subtractions around the world, can be attributed to Africa. Africa is at about 1 billion. It's going to grow to over 4 billion, according to the UN. If family size stays where it is today, which nobody really expects to happen around the world, but the UN does provide the numbers here, we're going to grow to almost 22 billion by 2100. The other two lines, those darker and lighter green lines, they are what if lines. What if every woman on Earth had 1/2 child more or 1/2 child fewer than the UN projects? It shows that small change can yield to enormous differences over time. Now, I know people who are really worried about that bottom lower line. They're worried that we're going to have some kind of people shortage. I have not noticed one myself, and I'm not particularly worried about it. But if we were to extend that line out a couple of thousand years, as it dropped, perhaps, maybe at some point, millennia from now, we might run into a people shortage. Perhaps we should erect a giant petroglyph with figures showing people, if we're still around as a species, exactly what they can do to solve this people shortage. My hunch is that they could figure it out on their own. Most species do, birds, bees, and what have you. But I think that population stabilization, zero population growth, is an important challenge, but I think we need to move beyond it to population reduction. And we need to figure out ways to recognize that that could be a positive outcome, not only for our environment, but also for our economy. And we wrote a book on that called The Good Crisis, or published a book, which if you go to our website, it's available as a free download at popconnect.org. Now, looking at Africa for a moment and looking at Nigeria, which is the most populous nation in Africa, these are two of the wives of an impoverished bricklayer, both married and as girls, with several of their children. These generally are girls who've never known what a chance in life would be, what an alternative, what the possibilities would be. And we have to find ways to transform their lives and give them options and possibilities that they don't now have. If we want to get off this terrible situation that we're creating. Today, there are about 218 million women in poor countries, LMICs, or low and middle income countries, that have an unmet need for modern contraception. That is to say, they don't want to be pregnant. They don't want to be pregnant, but they face barriers to contraception. And we know how to overcome those barriers. They are surmountable. There are wonderful programs today that, and essentially the most important part of it is not one thing, but the most important part of it is two things, really. One, make sure the supplies are consistently available of all methods. Two, women with some training go into villages, go into huts, go into communities. And these are women who look like, talk like, cook like these women. and they sit down and have private conversations about a very private matter. It's incredibly effective, and the people who do it know how to do it and know how to surmount and address cultural differences and challenges. But it takes money. Unfortunately, we've had several administrations in recent years that have been doing exactly the opposite. Reagan, both Bushes, and Trump all imposed the global gag rule. And we don't have the final numbers yet on what happened when Trump imposed it, but this shows what happened to the abortion rate, of all things, in sub-Saharan countries when, see the red dotted line, when the second George Bush reimposed the global gag rule. The abortion rate nearly tripled in those countries because it forced the closing of family planning clinics. In fact, this program not only increased abortion, it increased unsafe abortion, it increased unplanned pregnancy, it increased infant mortality, it increased maternal mortality. It was a devastating program. And you would think that those people who profess to be most concerned about abortions would have risen up against this policy instead of applauding it when it nearly tripled the rate. Now, thankfully, President Clinton, then Obama, then Biden, rescinded this. But we are pressing for legislation that has now cleared the House and is now pending as the Senate moves through its year, that would bar any future president from reimposing the global gag rule. And we think that has a very decent chance of getting signed into law this year. President Biden has assured us he will sign it. We have the slimmest of majorities in the Senate who support it right now. It's just a question of getting it past the gate, if you will. And the gate is sometimes called Mitch McConnell. Because it's in a money bill, something has to happen this year. So it's not something that is necessarily going to be hit by the filibuster, but it does face some challenges. Now, the programs that operate around the world are so effective. This is a photo actually from Pakistan showing one woman, obviously appears to be culturally of the same general background as another woman. Some of her options in terms of family planning. These programs are incredibly effective, but they're starved for money. They're starved for funding. And here's what the money does, and here's what it can do. This past year, even although Trump did everything he could do to wreck these programs, thankfully his impediments have been removed. This year, the one we're still in, we're investing about $607.5 million. This is what it does. It serves 27 million women. It prevents 12 million unintended pregnancies. It prevents unplanned births. It prevents maternal deaths. It prevents unsafe abortions. For every additional $10 million, we're able to achieve more steps. Essentially, it costs $25 a year to provide one woman in the global South with the access that she needs. It's just that we need about 218 million of those $25 investments. So we are seeking additional funds. I'm pleased to report that every single Democrat in the House supported and voted for a 37% increase in funding this year. It's not all we wanted, but anytime you can get a 37% increase in funding, it's cause for celebration. That bill is now pending in the Senate, and I'm not picking out Senator Merkley over Senator Wyden because one has a better record than the other. They both have perfect records on the issues we care about. But Senator Merkley is on the Appropriations Committee. He's on the Money Committee. And the way these things work, they go through that committee. And he has been absolutely a stalwart supporter of these programs. And if any of you have occasion to communicate with him in any fashion, you don't need to have a PhD in population studies. Just asking him, thanking him for his support for eliminating the global gag rule, thanking him for supporting increases in family planning, and just requesting that he do what he can to continue to increase that funding, because it transforms women's lives, it reduces population pressures, and it's one of the best ways that we can go about addressing climate change. Now, just wanted to show you one last cartoon here, which you can see for yourself. We've gone up and up and up. This was 7 billion a few years ago on the way to 10. But on the bright side, we do now have cartoons on recycled paper, or we used recycled electrons to read a lot of these things these days. Now, this was taken before COVID. By the way, I divide time into two categories, but I'm not being religious: BC and AD, before COVID and after Donald. And I recommend those to people as a new formulation. But this was a picture taken several years ago in DC, where we brought several hundred young people to Washington to learn about the issues and to lobby. And I'm very pleased that when we do so, we're able to bring a really diverse group to Washington. Many more women than men, but that's just a self-selection process. We're always glad to get young men involved. You would think, all things considered, that there would be more young men who'd be interested in being where young women are, but I can't really speak for them. Perhaps they are, perhaps they aren't, but certainly we try to bring the best and brightest we can and make sure that we're reaching out to some non-traditional communities. And so we bring a lot of young people of color to Washington. They learn about these issues, and then they go up and they get to do lobbying on Capitol Hill and express their views there. Now, we've had to shift away from that, which has been both a challenge and opportunity for us. This year, we had to do our annual event virtually, and we didn't get to bring these great young people to Washington, but we did reach 9.2 million people through our Twitter feed. I'll be quite honest with you. If Twitter went away, I would not feel the loss personally, but you use these tools that are available these days to reach people any way you can. And certainly we do that virtually through our work. If anybody would like to be involved with this and you're technologically oriented, you can text Pop Connect to 52886. You can also go to our website, popconnect.org, to sign up, or if you dig around there, you can also find my email address pretty easily, john@popconnect.org. I'm happy to hear from you as well. I would just close by saying that human population growth is one of the few challenges on this planet where we know what works, it's relatively affordable, and it's something that hundreds and hundreds of millions of women in particular want. And so it's not going to solve all our problems, but it's going to make almost all of them easier to solve. And in this day and age, anything that we can do that gets us there is worth doing. So thank you for your time. And I wish I was actually there, but I'm not. So I'm here.
Thank you so much, John, for an informative presentation and for your work at Population Connection. I know we're going to have many questions coming in. I'll go ahead and ask the first one and get the ball started here. You mentioned toward the beginning of your presentation that you were starting to have more people from around the world on your board and contributing voices. Do you have any anecdotes from that as far as what people are saying and any real impacts from that so far?
Yeah, one of our new board members is a Guatemalan doctor, Rodrigo Barrias, who has been the executive director. He's just transitioning to a new job in Guatemala, but he's been the executive director of a program called WINGS, W-I-N-G-S, which works in rural Guatemala with indigenous women who have very little access to any kind of health services, including reproductive health services. They have mobile clinics, and they work with those women. He got some of his training at Harvard, a really terrific guy. The origin story of WINGS, I think, is a fascinating one. There was a woman, first name Sue, who worked for a US woman, American woman, who worked for the State Department and decided it was time to retire. And so she did. And she didn't get rich working for the federal government. And she decided to relocate in her retirement to Guatemala because she'd been there as a Peace Corps volunteer in her youth and just loved the climate, the country, and her money went pretty far there. Well, she got there and her big plan was to sit on the beach and read books. And several women came up to her, Guatemalan women, and said, we know a number of women who have many, many children and they really want tubal ligations, but they can't afford them. And can you help? And of course, her first thought was they assume because I'm an American, I'm rich. And she said, well, how much money are you looking for? And they kind of looked embarrassed and said, well, we need $25. And she said, well, and she thought about it and thought about it. And I don't know whether she considered that if she sits on the beach and reads books, she'll just get skin cancer, and that's not good for you. So she wrote to a bunch of her friends in the United States and raised $5,000. And then she decided that wasn't enough. And instead of retiring, she founded Wings, which is now this wonderful organization that we work with and we partner with and we support financially, and we encourage others to support financially as well. I personally love to find smaller organizations that don't always get the big bucks, but that are doing amazing work. And if you're ever looking for an organization like that, that you could invest anything in, $25. You can just type Wings, WINGS, Guatemala, and you can read about it. And we annually reach out to all of our members to encourage them to support Wings and make sure the 100% of that money goes straight to Wings. Another story is one of a new board member named Melvine Oyo. Melvine Oyo is Kenyan. She's an RN. She also just got her MPH, but for a long time has been an RN. She was a family health practitioner. We got to know her. We brought her over to the United States to do some speaking tours. She got accepted at the Kennedy School and got her master's degree from there, and has gone back to Guatemala to work in slum areas with young women. And now she's just joined our board. And I think it's and we also support, she just recommended an organization to us, which we just began supporting in Kenya, because it's so important to walk the talk and not just say, oh, look at what these people are saying here or there. But when you put people in the global South in positions of power, that I think speaks volumes about your commitment. And maybe these nice board members will decide to keep this old white guy around for a while. And if not, I've got 2 grandkids who'd love to play with me. So I kind of win-win either way. But those are some of the stories of the people we work with.
Thank you. Very inspiring.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, John, for your great presentation. One thing that I've been seeing lately is concern of some countries that their economic growth isn't where they want it to be in the midterm future, like China and Israel. And so they're encouraging more fertility in those places. So I think part of the problem is trying to convince countries that they need to be on a more sustained economic growth path, so they don't just go for increased economic growth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. First, I will note, as I alluded to earlier, that if you go to our website, popconnect.org, there's a little search box there. And if you type the words good crisis in, that will take you to a page where you can download a free PDF of a book we published several years ago on this very topic, which is mostly a compilation of scholarly essays with some human interest stories put in to keep it from being too dry. And essentially, if you think first about an economy in the context of a family, and this isn't the only way to look at it, but it's one way to look at it. What makes the economics of a given family stronger? Most people have children. Some don't. Some choose to be child-free. Some sadly aren't able to fulfill their own dreams, and that's a sad thing. But I don't think there are many of us that consider our economic fortune and plans predicated on having as many children as is possible. That's not really the way it works, even leaving aside all the non-economic considerations. So there's a professor at Harvard named David Bloom, and he puts forward a theory that Speaking about it in economic terms for a moment, leaving sort of the important criteria of sustainability out of it just for the moment, laying that over here and coming to it in a moment. What makes an economy strong? Well, an economy can't be stronger than the productive people in that economy. You need productive people. Not just people, they have to be productive people. Well, what makes people productive? Well, Dr. Bloom puts forward three key elements. One, it's very hard to be productive if you're not healthy. We all know how hard it is when we don't feel well to get anything done. And whether that illness is physical or mental, whatever it is, it's a real impediment to us. And when you look at children, if children can't grow up healthy, and that means nutrition and good medical care, it's very hard for them to become productive citizens down the road. The second element Dr. Bloom identified, and it's in our book, is education. Educated people are much more likely to be productive. It opens the worlds for people. It creates opportunities that just aren't there any other way. And so we need well-educated people. Well, if you have fewer children, you have more money to invest in each child in terms of education. And the third element that Dr. Bloom identified was removing the impediments that prevent people from working if they choose to do so. Those can be physical impediments. They can be attitudinal impediments with older people, for example, or with other people for various reasons. Interesting story, BMW, the auto company in Germany, found that its older auto workers were less productive than its younger workers. But then they wondered why. And they made two changes in their factories in Germany. They replaced the concrete floors with wooden floors, those old knees. And they also put in magnification equipment. Well, all of a sudden, the productivity of the older workers went right up to the level of the younger workers. The head of Deutsche Bank once said, young people run faster, but old people know where the shortcuts are. I don't know if any of you saw Sunday Morning today, but there was a great story about a 78-year-old, I believe, lobsterman in Massachusetts, whose crew consists of his 101-year-old mother, who's out there 3 days a week. And somebody asked her, well, the person doing the story said, what would you say if your son said he was going to retire? She'd say, well, I'd want to know what's wrong with him. Is he sick? What's wrong? Let's get out there. And so there's so much untapped productivity in this country. And so I would say to China that rather than trying to prescribe how many children women should or shouldn't have, why don't they focus, and every other nation too, focus on making the people that are there and the young people as productive as possible? If you look at Israel, for example, there is this sort of unfortunate competition, for lack of a better word, among some of the ultra-Orthodox and some of the people who are not of the Jewish faith, who are Muslim, sort of thinking they can sort of outpopulate each other. And if that isn't too graphic a way of putting it, that's not going to go well for anybody. That there's no scenario where that ends up working out for anyone. We've got to find better ways to go about this stuff.
David Peterson had a couple of comments kind of leading to a question. He asked about micro loans for women starting businesses to empower women around the world. And also, was there ever thought in any country to pay women not to have children?
Well, there are, first things first, certainly I'm not suggesting that addressing population is sort of the old problem with the universal solvent. What are you going to put it in? I'm not saying it's a panacea. There are other methods. Certainly, education is key. Certainly, anything that you can do to enable the elevation of the status of women, period. And any which way you do it is a good idea. And there are so many different methods. Microloans are one of them. There are some places in Africa where what they do now is if a young girl is attending school and she goes to school every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday afternoon, she takes a market basket of food home with her. Now, it's unfortunate that that's what it takes to value that girl's education. But if that's what it takes, let's do it. let's do it. It's not a perfect world. If that's the way to keep her in school, then keep her in school by any means. So certainly microloans are good. The As far as paying people not to have children, in a sense we do, but it's sort of the equivalent of what Amory Lovins, the energy expert, refers to as the negawatt. That is to say, energy conservation can be cheaper than building new fossil fuel or other fuel facilities. Believe me, anybody who ever had a child as part of some brilliant financial plan, maybe that worked out for Bill Gates's dad, but I wouldn't recommend it in a general context. Children are a terrible investment financially. Those who choose freely to be child-free come out way ahead financially. The problem here is that one way or another, we men, if I may say so, and I don't mean to be too harsh on anyone other than myself, maybe it'd be good for us to just stop trying to control women, period. Just cut it out. Don't just get out of the business altogether. You know, there's nothing more personal and private than the decision to have children. And I think in fact, we know now, there's abundant evidence that when you address access to contraception, when you empower women, when you provide education, family size plummets. When we were founded in 1968, there were about 4 countries on earth that were at or below replacement rate. Today, there are nearly 100. And with the exception of China and the partial exception of several other countries, every place that's happened, it's been because of empowerment and expansion of opportunities for women. That's what's key.
We have a question in the chat, kind of timely to today's news from Val and Kathy Humble. Does the Taliban have any position on contraception?
Oh, Lord. I don't hold myself to be an expert on that, although I'm not sure we have any. Frankly, I'm not so sure we have any experts here. Their track record from the last time they were in power could not possibly be worse. Could not possibly be worse. I would say they treat women like property, but even that doesn't begin to encompass the horrors that women have been subjected to by the Taliban. Will they be a little less worse this time around? I don't think there's anybody outside of the Taliban that knows, and I'm not sure even they know at this point. I just couldn't possibly feel worse for the women in Afghanistan right now. It's hard to see how good will come out of any of this. I think the best we can hope for is something a little less awful than the last time. But it is, I was in a meeting some years ago, this was back when Hillary Clinton was a senator, and she talked in that meeting about how she had championed an additional $60 or $70 million for Afghan women and had gotten it through Congress, gotten it signed into law, had gotten the money into the pipeline. And even then it was not getting to the women who needed it. And she was just furious about it. And certainly you couldn't find a more savvy practitioner of the political process in that regard than Senator Clinton. But just the difficulties, even in good times, of doing this in places like that. So it's hard to be anything but pessimistic.
I have another question.
I do want, if I could, hasten to add that that's not a broad brush that I would apply universally to Muslim nations. There are some Muslim nations that have outstanding records on family planning, others that are so-so, and others that are terrible.
Okay. I have another question as I wait for final questions from our group. And that is, one of the statistics that surprised me in your presentation was the 37% of unintended US births. That seemed like a really high number to me because it seems something that would be difficult for many people to admit. How did that statistic come about? What are some of the groups that make up that number?
Well, the number comes from the Centers for Disease Control. One of the things they do very deep research. They do something called the National Survey on Family Growth. And I guess any report, any number, any statistic can be open to question. But I have to tell you, I mean, I've been doing this stuff for 25 years. And when I learned that number, it surprised me. Not shocked me, but it surprised me that it was as high as it was. Now, I want to be clear, unintended covers sort of three different categories of births, if you will. One, and this is a very technical term, happy accidents. You could have a woman or a couple who are planning to have a child in the next year or two, and they go, oh, we're a little ahead of schedule. And in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't have a lot of impact. And that's about a third of the unintended births. The second third are women and couples who, when asked, say, we're thinking maybe about having another child at some point, but not anytime soon. Well, we all know life changes and later can become never about many things in life. So that's a little more speculative. The third piece of this, and the real tragedy, are the births that are truly unwanted. And Dr. King in 1966 spoke about the tragedy, nothing more tragic than a child who isn't wanted. And when he wrote those words, there were about 400,000 children in the United States every year who were truly unwanted. And what that means, the way the CDC does it, is they ask women after they've given birth. When you would think we all revise our history a little bit as we go along, being humans, but these women say, no, I didn't want the child. And talk about a terrible tragedy all the way around. And so the numbers, you're never going to get unwanted births down to zero. But when you have contraceptive methods, should a woman elect to choose it, where you're only going to have 5 births out of 10,000, that number could be much, much lower than it is today.
Hey, Erasimo Acosta asked in chat, does Population Connection, or do you have any thoughts on reducing corporate growth or reducing the work week to 36 hours?
Well, our work week is is at 37 and a half hours. Everybody works that much. Some people do a little more, and the people who are not, we're very careful to follow wage and hour rules, but there are some of us who, if we choose to work a little more, that's kind of our business. It's a little bit out of, I as an individual, I have opinions about really everything. But we as an organization try to stay fairly close to our own mission in terms of that. In terms of the role of corporations when it directly involves our issue, they just kind of stay away from it. They're mucking up a lot of things. They're not really directly mucking up what we do, but they're certainly not helpful either. I'm not sure I have a lot more to say on the subject because it's really kind of falls outside our mission.
Okay, I've got one more comment in the chat. I'm going to click on here. Let's see if, question from Jessica. Where can our effort or money be best contributed?
Well, you might think I'd say send us a check, and certainly we welcome contributions. All of our funding comes from 40,000 dues-paying members around the country. And if any of you are on the call on the meeting right now, thank you so much. We appreciate it so much. We have enormous gratitude toward those 40,000 people. However, whenever somebody asks me this question, my first answer is always the same. Support your local Planned Parenthood. That's where it has to start. That's not where it should end. I hope if you have the financial wherewithal to support more than one cause, you can do more than that. But your local Planned Parenthood is literally on the front lines. And in some communities, that term has a true belligerent dimension. They are literally dealing with threats, hopefully not so much in some parts of the country as others. But your local Planned Parenthood is doing incredibly important work. And the fact that, as their saying goes, they provide care no matter what. Our board includes the woman who's the chief operating officer for Planned Parenthood of the Rockies. We work very closely with Planned Parenthood. Certainly, if you're interested in our work, you can go to popconnect.org and check it out. As I mentioned, I'll put in a plug for the wonderful organization in Guatemala, Wings. Their budget's about $1 million a year. They're pretty small. They're kind of too small to get money from some of the really big sources. So anything you can do for them, if you could see your way to giving them $25, it's going to go a long way there. I know the organization, we've visited them, they've visited us, they do great work. So there's so many wonderful and great causes, but I would kind of put it that way.
Thank you, John, for your presentation and for your quality work. You're working on the forefront issue of our time.